And it takes, I mean, this is really stunning looking back from the 21st century, where we can act anywhere in the world on a moment's notice with overwhelming force, to think that America was able to send a small token force under Pershing by July of 1917, but there is no serious, large-scale American action until almost a year later. It's in 1918 that we see American action largely through the Argonne Forest. That's unbelievable, and that's a measure of just what kind of a nation America was prior to this war. So you mentioned transformation. America was changed into a modern, mobilized military power through the course of this war, and that's why one of the biggest questions of all in the 1920s was, would America be able to retrace its steps? Would it be able to return to what Harding memorably calls normalcy? What will that ever look like? And we have what Robert Higgs calls the ratchet effect here. And the size of the bureaucracy never goes back to what it was. The size of the military never goes back to what it was. The degree of intervention in the U.S. economy never goes back to what it was.
Hey, read a quote from you. This is from Woodrow Wilson, Flag Day, 1917.
Yes.
He says, this is a people's war for freedom and self-government amongst all the nations of the world. And woe be to that man or that group of men that seeks to stand in our way in this day of high resolution, end quote. So how, you hear a speech like that, there's really not a lot of room for honest opposition in Woodrow Wilson's mind. This is the president of your country. Overwhelming support, voting for a declaration of war in the Congress as well. And we know there was a propaganda campaign, mail opening campaign, but people's mail was read. There was an active attempt, the Sedition Act, to punish dissent in America. And it is incredible when you read these stories of what happened to our country during World War I, to think about how quickly the country changes from these classical liberal principles to the federal government actively stamping out opposition to a war. Or even just at the level of talking about ideas, even. It's an amazing thing. And then the draft, conscription, and I think, what was it, 50,000 soldiers or 120,000 soldiers died?
Yes, that's from both disease and combat.
So that is, and it seems to require. It seems where this total war effort required. Maybe it did require to pull it off. It required Woodrow Wilson and this sort of political, religious faith being joined together, or at least interrelated to understand sort of a salvific purpose for all of this. It was interesting. I took my family to a Memorial Day, not celebrate, but ceremony this week, and very very nice, very moving ceremony, but still the same thing, that none of these soldiers will have died in vain. As we look back and remember them, and it's almost as if when a nation goes to war, unless it's a war of sort of pure self-defense, you really have to put it in those terms, and you really do have to see those opposing you in a new light, in a harsh light.
And that's exactly the kind of conundrum that the great British historian Herbert Butterfield, from whom I took the title War for Righteousness, that's the very thing he was wrestling with. And he feared that he might almost say, like, woe be to us if it's true that a democracy can't be mobilized in any other way. That's not a compliment to modern mass democracy if we can only be mobilized by spiritualizing our warfare in this way. And Butterfield's classic concern there is this ends up breaking down all the constraints on how do you wage limited war if you believe you are going to make the entire world safe for democracy? How do you wage limited war for limited objectives if you're telling the American people that this is the final war in the emancipation of humanity. So, we like to think that, well, that's so idealistic and that's admirable, because to be idealistic is, of course, inspiring and it's noble. But we have to be so careful about that, because a radically idealized war forgets about limits. It forgets about what warfare can actually achieve in the world and what it can't achieve. And it leads us to, well, I'll use strong language here. It leads us to delusional thinking.
Well, yeah, and on the backside of that, I think, is you forfeit a lot of trust when enough people realize they've been had.
Yes.
And it's trust and credibility that a government can never really regain. And I've increasingly come to think about that observation with regard to our own government.
Yes.
Once since our government, so we do win the Cold War. We did, World War I, we prevailed World War II. But this sort of ongoing marshaling of resources for ends that, you think about the Vietnam situation, things that really can't be achieved, the ways in which we say we're going to achieve them or held, lead people thinking, here we go again. Another crisis we have to be mobilized for. Yeah, and it's interesting. I even think of that about